I still remember that night clearly. I was in the attic dust all around me, searching for something as simple as an old photo album. Then my hand brushed against a wooden box tucked deep under a pile of blankets. It felt heavier than it should, locked, but fragile from age. When I pried it open, my heart almost stopped. Inside were yellowed letters, fading photographs, and a journal with pages worn thin from time. At first, I thought it was nothing more than keepsakes. But then, as I began to read, a different story revealed itself. The neat handwriting belonged to my grandmother. Every word bled with emotion, pain, and longing. I realized in that dim attic light that the love story I had always imagined for my grandparents, the quiet, simple, wholesome life, was not the truth at all. Their life had been a battlefield. Their love had been a rebellion.
For the first time in my life, I felt as though I never truly knew them.
Growing up, I always thought of my grandparents as ordinary people. They never spoke much about their past. My grandfather was the kind of man who sat silently at the head of the table, his eyes soft but unreadable. My grandmother always smiled, but behind her smile there was something else, something I had never bothered to notice. But the journal revealed what had been hidden for decades. It began with humiliation. In those early years, back in the 1940s, their love was not something to be celebrated. My grandmother wrote of the day they first dared to walk together in public. The whispers came first, then the stares. Neighbors turned their heads. Family members who should have stood by them crossed the street instead.
And then came the words, "You're shaming us. Do you even know what people will think? You're throwing your future away for him."
She wrote of standing in the center of her parents' house, trembling as her own mother's voice cut through her. My grandfather sat outside waiting on the porch, his head bowed, knowing he wasn't welcome inside.
Every letter carried the weight of that rejection. She described how humiliating it felt to be judged not for who she was, but for whom she loved.
There was an entry about a Sunday afternoon when they tried to attend church together. The whispers turned into glares. They weren't invited to sit with the rest of the family. My grandmother recalled the heat rising in her face as people moved away, leaving empty space around them. It was as though their love was contagious, something to be avoided. And yet she stayed by his side. I could almost hear her voice through the pages. She admitted she cried in secret, afraid she was weak, afraid she would break under the weight of it all. She didn't want to shame her family, but she couldn't let go of him either. One entry struck me harder than the rest. She wrote, "I wish I could disappear just for one day so no one could look at us with those eyes. But when I see him waiting for me, even if it's in the cold, even if it's in silence, I feel stronger. The world humiliates me, but he restores me."
Reading those words, I had to stop. My throat tightened, my hands trembled. These weren't just stories from the past. These were wounds, deep scars carried for a lifetime.
I realized then that my grandparents hadn't lived a quiet, simple life by choice. They had lived it because they were forced into silence. They had endured humiliation, judgment, and shame, all for the crime of loving one another. And the hardest part, they bore it without telling us. The more I read, the more unbearable it became. Because humiliation, as cruel as it was, wasn't the end of their suffering. It was only the beginning. The journal shifted in tone as the months passed. What started as anger and defiance soon turned into something darker, fear pressure, the kind of weight that forces people into choices they never wanted to make. There was an entry dated November 1943. My grandmother's handwriting was shaky, blotched with what looked like teardrops. She wrote, "My father said it would be better if I left town. He said distance would heal this mistake. He called it a phase. He begged me to think of our family's reputation. Tonight I told him I would go."
I froze when I read that line. She had agreed to leave him. And then came the hardest part.
I didn't even say goodbye. He waited for me on the corner the way he always does, but I couldn't face him. I walked the other way. I heard his footsteps behind me, then silence. I wonder if he knew. I wonder if he still waited long after I was gone. I tried to imagine that night my grandfather standing in the cold, scanning every face that passed by, hoping for just a glimpse of her. Did he wait hours believing she'd come? Did he return home broken, knowing she'd chosen her family over him? The image tore at me. Their separation wasn't just physical. It was a wound, one that nearly bled them dry. For months the letters stopped. The journal went quiet. She had moved in with relatives far away where no one knew her shame. She described the loneliness in excruciating detail. The silence is unbearable. I sit by the window and imagine his face, his voice. I wonder if he hates me now. I wonder if I hate myself more. Page after page, she spoke of nights filled with regret, days spent pretending to smile, while inside she felt hollow. But what broke me most was the way she described her attempts to forget. There is a boy here who likes me. He is kind, gentle. My parents would approve. Sometimes I let him walk me home, just so I won't feel so alone. But when he reaches for my hand, I pull away. Because it's not the right hand. It's not his hand. Meanwhile, tucked between those pages, I found letters written by my grandfather never sent. He had kept them folded carefully as if afraid they'd be lost to the world. One letter read, "I waited for you last night. I told myself you were late, that you would come running, smiling the way you always do, but you never came. Still I will wait tomorrow and the next day, as long as it takes."
Another one. They think they've won. They think distance will break us. But they don't know. I don't care if I wait a year or 10 years. I will not give up on you.
I couldn't breathe as I read them. His loyalty was absolute, but it was loyalty paid in loneliness. The journal picked up again months later, her words trembling with guilt.
I saw him today. I wasn't supposed to, but fate is cruel. I was walking through town when our eyes met. He looked thinner, older somehow. He didn't smile. I wanted to run to him to beg forgiveness, but my cousin pulled my arm and I let him walk away. I think I died a little inside.
It was the kind of separation that eats at you, not just while you're apart, but every second of every day. A love that's forced into silence becomes poison, something that corrodes from within.
As I turned the final page of that section, my grandmother's handwriting grew heavier, as though each word cost her strength. I cannot live like this anymore. My heart is not here. It has never been here. No matter what they say, no matter what they want, I cannot keep pretending. If I lose him forever, I lose myself.
And then the entry simply ended. No date, no explanation, just silence. That silence was worse than the words. Because words, at least, gave me answers. Silence left only questions. Did she run back to him that very night? Did he forgive her as quickly as he had promised in those letters? Or did more time pass, stretching the wound deeper? Sitting there in the attic, I realized something. Their separation wasn't just a chapter, it was the test. The cruelest trial their love had to endure. And somehow, despite everything, it would lead them to the next stage of their story.
A story not of endings, but of survival.
When I turned the next section of the journal, the handwriting changed. The letters weren't as neat, the lines pressed deeper into the paper as though every word was carved with frustration. This was no longer the story of separation. This was the story of what happened after they chose each other again, and how life punished them for it. There was an entry dated early 1945. My grandmother wrote I couldn't stay away any longer. I went back to him. I didn't care who saw me, who whispered. For the first time in months, I felt alive again. But the happiness was short-lived. My grandfather had been working odd jobs since the war ended, long hours at the factory, late shifts at the dock. Pay was low, food was scarce, and no one was eager to help two people who had defied their families. They were on their own. She described their first place together, a cramped room above a butcher's shop walls, thin enough to hear every argument downstairs. The window leaked when it rained, the mattress sagged in the middle. But to them, it was freedom. Still, freedom came with a price, she wrote. We have bread and beans. Some days, not even that. He works until his hands bleed, but it is never enough. I try to sew clothes for neighbors, but they pay little. Sometimes I hear the other women whisper that I should have chosen better. At night, I lie awake, wondering if they are right. Those words cut me, because even after choosing each other, the humiliation had followed them, only now it was laced with poverty. The more I read, the more vivid the downfall became. There was a story about their first winter. The coal ran out. My grandfather tried to keep the stove burning with scraps of wood, but the cold crept in through every crack. She described holding their newborn child, my uncle, in her arms, wrapping him in layers of cloth, praying he wouldn't get sick.
I felt like a failure, she wrote. I had chosen love, but what kind of mother cannot even keep her child warm?
And then there were the fights. For the first time, the journal revealed words I had never associated with them: anger, resentment, despair. He came home late again, smelling of smoke and steel. I asked why he was drinking, and he shouted that he works all day for nothing, only to come home to complaints. I shouted back that I gave up everything for him, and now I am watching our child shiver in the cold. For the first time I saw doubt in his eyes, and it scared me more than hunger ever could. That entry made my hands tremble, because I had only ever seen my grandparents as calm, steady, unshakable. But here, in their own words, they were on the edge of breaking. There was another letter unsent, written by my grandfather. His handwriting was rough, uneven.
I feel like I am drowning. Every day I wake before the sun, and every night I return too tired to speak. She deserves more than this. The child deserves more. I fear I am losing them, not because I don't love them, but because love is not enough.
Those words haunted me. He had fought the world for her, only to feel he was failing her in the quiet moments of daily life. The journal continued with smaller entries, each one a glimpse into their downfall. One described selling her wedding dress for groceries. Another spoke of pawning his pocket watch, the only heirloom he had from his father. Piece by piece, she wrote, we gave away the things that tied us to our past, until all we had left was each other. But sometimes I fear even that will not survive. Then came the story that nearly shattered me. It was about their second child, my mother. She was born sickly, fragile, her cries faint. Doctors warned she might not survive the winter. My grandmother begged neighbors for milk for medicine, but most turned her away. Some even said it was God's punishment. She wrote, I sat by her cradle and thought, maybe they are right. Maybe I was selfish to choose this path. Maybe this is the price we pay. Those lines were smudged, as if she had pressed her face into the page, weeping. For days after reading, I couldn't shake that image. My grandmother, young and desperate, watching her baby struggle to breathe, believing her love had cursed her family. It was the kind of downfall that goes beyond money, beyond pride. It was survival itself, slipping through their fingers. And yet even in the darkest entries there were sparks. She wrote of how, on nights when the baby finally slept, my grandfather would sit beside her, holding her hand in silence. Sometimes they didn't have the strength to speak, but that silence was different. It was a reminder that even in failure they were failing together. Still, the cracks were real. I see how he looks at me sometimes, she wrote, as if I am both his reason and his burden. I wonder if he regrets it all. I wonder if deep down he wishes he had let me go that night. Reading that line, I closed the journal for a moment, because I knew what it felt like to carry silent doubts, to wonder if love could truly survive the weight of reality. When I returned to the attic, light, and turned the last page of that chapter, my grandmother's words lingered in my head. We chose each other, and in choosing we lost so much. I wonder how much more we can lose before there is nothing left. That was the heart of their downfall. Not just poverty, not just rejection, but the fear that even love, the one thing they had clung to, might not be enough to save them. And yet as I set the journal down, I realized their story didn't end there, because if it had, I wouldn't be here to read it. There had to be more. There had to be a turning point. By the time I reached the next section of the journal, the handwriting had softened again. It was still heavy, still marked with exhaustion, but something was different. It was as though after years of despair, a flicker of light had finally pushed through the cracks. It began with a single entry. Tonight our son asked me if I still loved his father. I froze. How could he see so much when he is still so young? That was the moment that changed everything. My uncle, barely 8 years old, had looked up from the dinner table, his eyes wide and innocent, and asked the question no one else dared to voice.
"Do you still love him, Mama?"
My grandmother described the silence that followed, the clatter of a spoon against a plate, the way my grandfather's hands stopped mid-motion. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then my grandmother answered. Her voice shook, but she said the truth. "Yes, I do." Her son nodded as if that was all he needed to know, but then he whispered the words that would echo through their lives. "Then don't leave him. I don't need anything else. I just need you two together." Reading that line, I felt the air leave my chest. A child's voice, simple and unpolished, had done what years of arguments, shame and poverty could not. It cut through the noise and went straight to the heart. In the following pages, my grandmother confessed how that single moment shook her to her core. I had been so focused on what we lacked, on what the world took from us, that I forgot what we still had. We had love. We had each other. And to our children, that was enough. The next entries painted a picture of quiet change. My grandfather, though, still burdened by work, began coming home earlier when he could. He started bringing small gifts, an apple, a ribbon, a piece of cloth. They weren't much, but they meant the world. My grandmother, instead of dwelling on what they didn't have, began writing about the little things that did bring them joy. She wrote about the laughter of their children, the smell of bread when she managed to trade sewing work for flour, the way her husband's hands, though calloused and tired, still reached for hers under the table.
And yet, the turning point wasn't just about love, it was about perspective.
One entry struck me deeply. We may never be rich, never be accepted, but our children do not care about whispers. They care about warmth, about laughter, about the safety of our embrace. I realized tonight that I was fighting the wrong battle. I don't need to prove our worth to the world. I only need to protect the world inside these walls. That shift was everything. But the real test came weeks later when tragedy nearly tore them apart again. Their youngest daughter, my mother, fell gravely ill one winter night. Fever raged through her small body, and they had no money for a doctor. My grandmother wrote of sitting by her bed holding a damp cloth to her forehead, praying through tears. She described how my grandfather burst into the house with medicine he could only have bought by selling his last valuable possession, his father's pocket knife. He placed it in her hands and said, "We will not lose her. Not now, not ever." The medicine worked. Slowly, my mother's fever broke and the color returned to her cheeks.
In that moment, my grandmother realized something.
He gave up the last piece of his past to protect our future. I thought love had been crushed under the weight of our struggles. But no, it had only been buried. Tonight I saw it again, burning as fiercely as it did the first time we met. The next pages glowed with renewal. Their struggles didn't vanish. They still lived in hardship, still faced whispers and rejection, but something had shifted within them. My grandmother wrote of evenings spent singing with the children of my grandfather, teaching them how to carve toys from scraps of wood. She described the way her heart swelled when she saw her children fall asleep in their father's arms, safe and loved. For the first time in years, she wrote, "I am not afraid of tomorrow." And yet what struck me most wasn't the events themselves, it was the way she described her husband. She no longer called him weary or burdened or doubtful. She began to call him strong, steady, home. She wrote, "When I look at him now, I see not the man the world despises, but the man who chose me when it would have been easier to let me go. That is the man I love. That is the man I will always choose." As I sat in the attic reading those words, I realized something. The turning point of their story wasn't a grand event. It wasn't money or acceptance or victory over those who shamed them. It was a child's question, a child's plea for love to endure, and it was enough to remind them of who they were and what they were fighting for. The final page of that chapter read simply, "We will stumble again, we will suffer again, but tonight I know no matter what the world takes from us, we will not let it take us from each other." As I closed the journal, I felt tears sting my eyes, because this wasn't just their turning point. In many ways, it was mine too. I realized then love isn't measured by perfection or by how the world sees you. It's measured by endurance, by the choice to stay even when everything else says to leave. And my grandparents, broken as they were, had chosen to stay. By the time I reached the next pages, I could feel the weight shifting. The journal no longer bled with despair. It wasn't joy, not yet, but there was something new threaded between the lines: resolve, a determination to rebuild. It began with an entry about the smallest of moments. "This morning my grandmother wrote he mended the broken leg of our table with his own hands. It may wobble still, but it holds." I looked at it and thought, this is us. We may not be perfect, but we are holding. That one line stayed with me. Because rebuilding rarely begins with something grand. It starts with the ordinary, the unnoticed, the little acts of care that slowly stitch the fabric back together. She described how, after the turning point with their children, they began to change their rhythm. My grandfather still worked long hours, but he tried to bring home anything that could spark joy. One night it was a bar of soap that smelled faintly of lavender. Another time it was a broken toy he had found at the docks and fixed up for his son. My grandmother in turn began to write less about shame and more about gratitude. "We laughed tonight," she wrote in one entry. "I burned the bread and the children teased me until I was red in the face." He laughed the loudest. For the first time in years, our house felt full. But rebuilding wasn't just about laughter. It was about effort, choosing to try day after day, even when it would have been easier to give up. My grandfather began repairing things around the neighborhood for small change: chairs, doors, fences. At first, people paid him reluctantly, but gradually respect crept back. One neighbor even said he may not have much, but he works harder than anyone.
That meant more than money. It was a step toward dignity.
The journal captured another shift, one that struck me personally. "I have stopped waiting for the world to accept us," she wrote. "Instead, I have started building a world inside our walls where our children feel safe, loved, and proud. That is all that matters." It wasn't a surrender, it was a decision. She couldn't control the whispers outside, but she could control the home within. There was an entry about teaching my uncle to read by candlelight. She described how her husband, though exhausted, stayed up to listen, nodding proudly at every stuttered word. She wrote, "When I see the way he looks at our children, I know we are rich in ways the world cannot measure." Still, it wasn't easy. The journal didn't sugarcoat the hardships. She admitted there were nights they still argued about money, about exhaustion, about the future, but the difference was they no longer threatened to walk away. Instead, their fights ended with apologies, sometimes with silence, sometimes with tears, but always with the decision to keep trying. One entry read, "He said he is afraid I will leave again. I told him I am afraid too. But then he took my hand and whispered, 'We are afraid together.' And that is enough." What touched me most were the details of their daily rituals. Every Sunday, no matter how little they had, they cooked a meal together, sometimes just potatoes and bread. They invited their children to help turning dinner into laughter and play. Every evening before bed, they would check the children's blankets, make sure they were warm, and whisper a prayer together. "We do not have much," she wrote, "but our children fall asleep knowing they are loved. That is more than many can say." As the months passed, the journal showed signs of strength returning. She began describing her husband not as weary, but as steady. She wrote of his hands, once broken by labor, now building toys, repairing shoes, mending cracks in the wall. She described herself not as ashamed, but as determined. She wrote of baking bread to share with a neighbor, of sewing a dress for her daughter, from scraps of fabric, of learning to smile even when her heart was tired. But what struck me most was an entry about a walk they took together. "The town still whispers," she wrote. "We still hear the words fools, outcasts, poor. But today we walked anyway, hand in hand. And when the children laughed behind us, it drowned out the whispers. For the first time, I did not feel small. I felt strong." That image lingered with me, two people who had once bowed their heads in shame, now choosing to walk upright, no longer for themselves, but for their children.
One of the last entries in that section said it best.
"We are not healed, not yet, but I can see it now, the pieces coming together. The cracks remain, but through them the light finds a way in. We are still here, we are still together, and that is enough to keep building." As I set the journal down, I realized how profound their rebuilding truly was. It wasn't about erasing the past or pretending the pain had never happened. It was about facing it, acknowledging it, and then deciding every single day to rise anyway. And in that attic, decades later, I felt the lesson pressing into me. Rebuilding doesn't look like triumph. It looks like persistence, like patching a table leg or sharing bread or holding hands despite the whispers. It looks like love lived in the smallest of ways. By the time I reached the next section of the journal, the tone had shifted again. It was gentler now, calmer. The words no longer trembled with fear or bled with anger. Instead, they carried the weight of time, time that had softened edges, time that had begun to heal wounds, once thought permanent. One entry began simply, "Today I saw my mother again. She did not look at me with hate, only with age. It had been nearly a decade since my grandmother had spoken to her family. For years, silence had been their punishment, their way of cutting her out. But life has a way of humbling even the harshest hearts. Her mother, now frail, reached out with trembling hands. No words of apology, no dramatic reunion, just a touch and a whispered, 'You look tired, child.'"
My grandmother wrote, "For a moment I was a little girl again, desperate for comfort, and I let her hold me. I thought I would feel anger, but instead I felt peace."
The journal was filled with more of these moments, small reconciliations, tiny steps toward healing. My grandfather, once rejected by nearly everyone, was now respected for his hard work. Neighbors who had whispered behind their backs began to nod at him in the streets. Some even asked for his help repairing fences, roofs, tools. "It is not forgiveness," my grandmother wrote, "but it is acceptance, and for us that is enough."
But the most powerful healing didn't come from the outside. It came from within their own home.
She described evenings when their children, now older, would sit at the table and share stories from school, laughter spilling across the small room. She wrote of the pride she felt when her son defended his sister from teasing, saying, "We don't care what people say, we are family." That more than anything showed her that their love had planted seeds, seeds that had grown into resilience in the next generation. There was a story that stopped me cold. She wrote about a visit from one of the relatives who had once mocked them most cruelly. This woman arrived unannounced, carrying her own child who was sick and thin. With tears in her eyes, she asked my grandmother for help. My grandmother could have turned her away. She could have spat back every insult, every cruel word. But instead, she opened the door, she fed the child, shared medicine, and gave them a bed for the night.
I thought it would feel like weakness, she wrote, but it felt like strength. To choose kindness over bitterness, to break the cycle instead of passing it on.
That was healing, not just for her, but for all of them. My grandfather, too, softened in those years. His letters, once filled with desperation, became filled with gratitude. One note read, "The world is still hard, but it no longer feels against us. Each day I wake to your face, to our children's voices, and I feel rich beyond measure. I do not need the world's approval. I have you. That is enough."
Reading that, I felt something stir in me. Because here was a man who had once been broken by whispers, now standing taller than ever, not because the world had changed, but because he had.
There were still scars. My grandmother admitted she sometimes woke in the night haunted by old doubts. She worried the whispers might return, that hardship might take hold again. But instead of hiding those fears, she shared them with him.
"He does not laugh at me," she wrote. "He simply takes my hand in the dark and says, 'We have survived worse. We will survive whatever comes.'" And somehow I believe him.
Healing wasn't quick, it wasn't complete, but it was real. I read entry after entry of their quiet victories, planting a garden that finally bore fruit, saving enough to buy a proper table, celebrating their daughter's birthday, with neighbors who once would not have come near. Each page was proof that love once broken could be mended, not perfectly, not without cracks, but beautifully nonetheless. One passage struck me harder than all the others. When I look back, I see humiliation, separation, and downfall, but I also see endurance, rebuilding, and forgiveness. I see that love is not about never breaking. It is about learning to heal together again and again. Those words stayed with me long after I closed the journal. And as I sat in the attic, the letters trembling in my hands, I realized that this was not just their healing, it was mine too, because I had grown up thinking love was simple, that it was something you either had or didn't. But here in their story, I saw the truth.
Love is bruised, it is battered, it falls apart. But if you choose to fight for it, if you choose to forgive, it can rise again. Stronger than before.
The last entry of that section was short, almost a whisper. "We are not the same as we once were. We are older, scarred, tired, but we are together. And together is enough." The final section of the journal was thinner than the rest. The ink was lighter, the pages worn from years of being folded and unfolded, as if these were the words they had read over and over again, the words that carried them into peace. The entry began with a description of a meal. Tonight, the house was full. The table, once broken, now sturdy, was surrounded by every face we love. Children, grandchildren, neighbors who once turned away. Laughter filled the room, louder than the whispers ever did. I paused when I read that line, because that table, the same one my grandfather had once mended with his bare hands, was still in our family home. I had sat at it myself countless times, never knowing the story it carried. She described the meal in vivid detail. There was bread, roasted chicken, bowls of potatoes, and even a pie, the kind of feast that once would have been unthinkable. But more important than the food was the feeling. I looked across the table at him, she wrote, and for the first time in decades I saw not the boy I once defied the world, for not the man beaten down by labor, not the father who doubted himself. I saw my partner, my companion, my home. The reunion wasn't about reconciling with every relative or proving anything to the town. It was about something greater, about the circle of family finally closing. My grandmother described how their children, now grown, raised their glasses and thanked them. They said we had taught them what love looks like. Not the storybook kind, but the kind that survives storms, that bends but does not break. I wanted to cry because for years I thought we had failed them. But tonight I saw we had given them everything. I could picture it, the flicker of candlelight across worn faces, the echoes of laughter bouncing off walls that had once heard only arguments and silence.
And then came the part that broke me.
She wrote, "When the meal ended, he took my hand the way he did when we were young. He whispered, 'We made it.' I nodded, tears in my eyes, because we had. Against every whisper, every hardship, every moment of doubt, we had made it."
That was their reunion.
Not a single grand event, not a dramatic scene of forgiveness from the world. Just a family gathered around a table, choosing love over bitterness, choosing togetherness over pride. But the journal didn't end there. There was one last entry written years later, shaky and faint. If anyone finds these words, know this love is not about never falling. It is about rising again, hand in hand. Our story is not perfect, but it is ours. And if our children and their children carry even a piece of it forward, then every wound, every scar was worth it. I closed the journal with trembling hands. For a long moment I just sat in the attic, surrounded by dust and silence, yet feeling as though the whole house was alive with their voices. That night I carried the journal downstairs. I placed it on the same table my grandfather had mended, and when my own family gathered, I told them the story. I watched as my children listened wide-eyed the way I had once listened to bedtime stories. Only this time it wasn't a fairy tale. It was truth. It was legacy. And as I looked at their faces, I understood what my grandmother meant. The real inheritance was not money, not possessions. It was love, the kind that endures humiliation, separation, downfall, rebuilding, healing, and still chooses reunion. The last words I will ever remember from that journal echoed in my head as I closed it for the final time. We are together, and together is enough.